Ja, herzlich willkommen. Welcome to the talk with Daniel Libeskind, who's sitting on my right, with Selfira Regulova, General Director of the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, also the state collections, who, with Marion Ackermann, who is sitting here in the front row, had around 4.5 years ago the idea for this amazing show. And now, 4.5 years later, we have this fantastic show here after it was shown in Moscow. So thank you, Selfira. Thank you, Marion Ackermann. And on my right side, on your left side, Holger Birkholz. Dr. Holger Birkholz is one of the curators of the show. As you may know, it was a Russian-German team that really worked together on one show. Sergei Fofanov, the second curator, is sitting here with a yellow cap. Welcome, Sergei. And Ludmila Makina, the third one, she left already back to Moscow. So before we start, I just wanted to introduce you a bit into the show, because it is not only the first time that Russian and German Romanticist painting is shown together, but we also try to cast a kind of new light on that painting. And I have to stick a bit to my paper because we're talking in English now. It is the socio-historical context of the show, of course, is the crisis of the subject. And in the early 19th century, of course, and the associated struggle for freedom. It is shortly after the French Revolution, when its liberal ideas were being propagated throughout Europe. And at the same time, it was Napoleon who was plunging the continent into war. In the name, of course, of those ideals of freedom. At the same time and afterwards, the conservative governments in Russia and the German states tried to restrict again the civil rights. The Romantic artists confronted this time of upheaval with an artistic cosmos dominated by emotions, with quite a revolutionary potential. Given that the period of Romanticism was crisis-laden, one of the aims of the show is to investigate also the political dimensions of the paintings of German and Russian Romanticism, in order to cast light on issues of concern to the people of those times. It was the formation of national identity, of course, the fragility of the concept of homeland and religion, and the longing for a life in freedom and the reality of the repressive political and social situation. And this draws, of course, close connections between the 19th century and our times. Many of the issues mentioned are as topical today as they were then, and thus the exhibition provides many starting points for considering our own, likewise, political complex era. We therefore also invited contemporary artists to participate, Susan Phillips, for example, with a sound piece, Mathilde Terheine, reflecting on the fact that, of course, we have very few female painters in the show. There's only one Russian female painter included, but also Andrei Kushkin, Boris Mikhailov, Toni Osler, Wolfgang Tillmans with works. And they show why, maybe why Romanticism is considered to be the dawn of modernism, content-wise and also concerning the form. At the same time, also the contemporary artworks highlight that the social and artistic processes initiated 2 centuries ago still continue. The questions of the subject, of a self-determined life in freedom, of security in a homeland of choice, and as well the threats of war. The interaction between politics and emotion is a subject not only for the current social discourse and its presentation in the media, but it is also evident in Romanticism. And the emotional intensity of the paintings of vast landscapes, like in Caspar David Friedrich, or the narrow, stiffy interiors that you find in the Russian Romanticist painting, and their constructedness, of course, and the fact they are often symbolically charged with a complex content and context, make them somehow political spaces. And now we come to Daniel, because that was the reason we asked him to develop the exhibition design, because we thought it was a perfect match. As his architecture, like Marion Ackermann often says, it's an architecture parlante. It is also quite symbolically working. And we are grateful to him and his whole team, Stefan Blach, David Heaton, his wife, Nina Libeskind, who's here with us tonight too, for the commitment for this show. And he and his team, they have succeeded in making the complexity of the subject matter, the discontinuities and the contradictions, the tensions and ambivalences, and of course the exhibition's current relevance, virtually, physically palpable. So thank you very much, Daniel. So my first question goes to Daniel Libeskind, and I think I don't have to present him because he's so known here in Dresden because of the Militärhistorischen Museum. But you might not know that he was born in Łódź, which is on the direct line from here to Moscow. Not halfway, but in between. And you will see in the show, or maybe you have seen already, that the axis between Moscow and Dresden plays an important role in the concept. He was born in 1946 in Łódź. At the age of 11, he went with his family to live in a kibbutz in Israel, later to Tel Aviv. And in 1959, he went to New York with his family. He began his career, of course, as an architectural theorist and professor, and was holding positions in various institutions. Before, in 1989, with his wife, Nina Libeskind, he founded the studio Daniel Libeskind. In Germany, of course, we also know his first big project, which was the Jewish Museum in Berlin. And you may also know that in 2003, he received further international attention after he won the competition to be the master plan architect for the reconstruction of the World Trade Center site. In Dresden, the Militärhistorische Museum was opened in 2011. Yeah, but the first question, Daniel, that I wanted to ask you, and it was a hint that Sergei Fofanov did in our talk in Moscow, was that even your surname connects you somehow with German Romanticism.
Thank you so much. Before I answer the question, I want to just tell you that this collaboration, Dresden and Moscow, was really one of the best in my life, with the most creative people, with the energy, the passion, the profundity, and solidarity to do something which is really not just another exhibition, but something really important, I think, for our time. So it is my thanks to all of you and those who are not here to thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful, really one of the best experiences I had in my life as an architect. Thank you. Okay, to answer this question, you know, my name is Libeskind, and I've often wondered, how did I get this name? It's not really your common name. And then when you really go into, you know, Jews in Poland back in the 19th century, 18th century, you discover that E.T.A. Hoffmann, that great writer, one of my favorites, was occupying the position which gave names to people. And I've always thought that Libeskind was a name given by Hoffmann, by E.T.A. Hoffmann, to my family. Really, I don't think it's coincidental that there is a link across time. Well, I cannot prove it, but I'm sure it's there because of my relationship to E.T.A. Hoffmann, my relationship to Poland, I'm Polish, and also to the German and Romantic state of mind, which, of course, the word Libeskind always evokes. Now, I can add another piece here to my name, first name, Daniel, which was not supposed to be my first name. I was born right after the Holocaust. My parents were prisoners. They returned to Łódź, and I was born just really there after they came back instantly from the prison camps. And my father took me to, the official birth certificate bureaucracy, an office somewhere in Łódź. And the woman said, what's the name of this infant? And he said, David, because David was the name that he wanted to give me. It was the name of the family, the name of my great-grandfather. The woman looked at him. This is the story my father told me just before he died. The woman looked at him and said, no, we don't accept this name. This is Poland, 1946. And my father was very perplexed. We don't accept the name for the birth certificate. So he sat down on the chair close by, thought and thought and thought, what should I do? I don't have another name. Thought, okay, a name starting with D, a Jewish name, Daniel. He went back, she wrote it down. That was my name, and he went back. And then he told me something very interesting. His first thought was, well, she was a communist, she was an anti-Semite, she refused to give a Jewish name to the baby. But then he said, I thought a little bit longer, and I thought perhaps she was Jewish, and she did not want to give that name to protect the child. So that's the story of names. Everything has a name, but I'm glad you asked that question, because names, what's in a name? Isn't that what Shakespeare says? What's in a name? What's in a name? Anyway, I wanted to share with you a little bit, because the issue of dream of freedom is not an issue that is foreign to us today. None of us has the freedom we expect to have. Whatever the political system we live in, there are great limitations, and it's difficult just to compare. But let me share with you just a few projects. If I don't know which button to press. Yes. Yeah, I got it. Yes,
ask Sophia a question, because yes. You already work together, right? This is not your first project.
That's right. Oh, sorry. Yes.
I'm the worst to deal with these devices.
No.
To talk about the first, because you work together.
Oh yes, many years ago.
Yes. We met. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, it seems this opening and the following days are the days when you say something very personal. So I first met you, and you don't remember that for sure, while we were working on the exhibition Moscow-Berlin, Berlin-Moscow, which took place in 1995 in Martin Gropius's Bau, which had 20 curators. We were talking yesterday about bringing together positions of 3 curators of the Dreams of Freedom show. There were 20 curators, 2 for each section, 1 German, 1 Russian, film, literature, architecture, a show of 2,500 objects. And before the exhibition opened, I don't remember what was the first. Did I see the installation of the Moscow-Berlin show in Martin Gropius's Bau or the Jewish Museum? You were taking people around the Jewish Museum. Since that day, I'm the biggest fan of yours. Because walking through that building, and we didn't travel too much before that, so you were the first great world scale architect to whose work I was like introduced or acquainted, I thought that this architecture is conveying so many messages that this building doesn't require any exhibits. And I still think, after seeing it 3 times empty and 1 time as a museum, that when it was empty, it was the best in the world monument to the Holocaust and to all those tragic stories. And it was a fantastic journey during which I understood also that Russian avant-garde, and I'm a specialist in Russian avant-garde and did several exhibitions of Russian avant-garde. I saw how much your architecture was influenced by the ideas of constructivism and of Russian avant-garde. And this complex journey came to my mind when we started thinking about who could not build the architecture, who could structure all those complex ideas and all these very different art, and not only art, but archival objects. There were many more of them in Moscow, so that it would be something which would convey the essence of Romanticism as we found, like, developed it during this process of the work, because what is for me very special about this exhibition is that it's not only just one more exhibition which you are doing in my life. It was a realization of my dream. I wrote my PhD. I tried to write my PhD on German Romanticism. I didn't finish it, but I gave birth to 2 wonderful daughters. I think that was a kind of a better outcome of that. This exhibition, which we had so successfully presented in Moscow and which looks fantastic here in totally different space, is for me a kind of realization of my duty as a researcher also. So what was developed a new understanding of the Romanticism, apart from quite banal concepts which people still keep about this incredibly important period, which is really the birth of modernity, and we still live in that model of creativity which for the first time was proposed by the artist of German Romanticism and Russian Romanticism. And they developed these ideas in much more complex and sophisticated way than artists in other countries. So anyhow, when I started thinking, I don't know why, but the first name which just came out from my mind and which I conveyed to Marion was Daniel Libeskind. I don't know, I didn't even think for a second. It was just an instinctual reaction. I also would like to share with you my impressions from my today's visit to the Military Historical Museum, which I heard much about and which will appear on the screen. It's one of the most stunning experiences, and this incredible and maybe very risky combination of very modern but quite transparent, I mean the angle from the outside with the historical building, this flexibility and richness of ideas which arise from, again, a journey, for me was one more justification apart from the success of the architecture in Moscow and here, that you were the only and the best possible architect for that exhibition. And that's not that I'm trying to say something nice. I mean it, and today, even with all of the temptation to go to the Gemälde Gallery, I spent more than 2 hours with my colleagues there. Two more words, and I think we should give the word to Daniel, because we all are people who live on Earth. You are among those architects who were sent to the earth somewhere from above. That incredible immersivity of the show, which we all experienced in Moscow. I, for 1 month after the dismantling, couldn't go in that space because I was feeling such a pity that it's over. And you cannot tremble with all of your body coming in and going through those galleries. And each time you went, you could choose a different way, and you were feeling and concentrating on some other aspects than during your previous visit. It was incredible richness of ideas which could be conveyed and which we maybe didn't even think about after finishing the checklist for the exhibition, which you had added to this show, making out of it a real romantic piece of art. It's a Gesamtkunstwerk, and das ist eine romantische Gesamtkunstwerk.
So Daniel, please start. Sorry for interrupting.
I wasn't really prepared to do sort of presentation, but to share with you just a few ideas, because the words dream of freedom, as I said, are not just abstract. They are also part of our lives today. This is a project on which I'm still working, which is Ground Zero in New York. It's a really whole city center. Let me put it this way. Those buildings represent millions of square feet of density. It's a downtown of a major American city like Baltimore or Denver. That's what's around the 16-acre site. And you can see in this image that I did start with the idea of the Statue of Liberty, which I encountered as an immigrant to the Bronx. And my idea was to really, in a symbolic and spatial way, inscribe a meaning to the site which is not an obvious one. This is from my book. I just show you what a master plan really is. It's not a design of single buildings. It's how to organize the complexity of the site. But what it shows is that I did not build where the tower stood. I left the space. No, there were many competitors in this competition, starting with about 500 or 5,000 in the beginning and reduced to 7 of my colleagues, great architects. I was the only one who said you should not build where the tower stood, because you cannot build where people perished, almost 3,000. So I put the buildings as far away from the center as possible, creating a public space, a memorial that goes all the way to the bedrock, and putting the towers really on the periphery, within the grid, but in a kind of a spiral motion, which is emblematic of the torch. And of course, there are other elements there, the visitor center, the museum, the performing arts center, which is under construction. So just a little glimpse into this. The slurry wall, that great foundation that you see on the left, I succeeded to keep it open. You know, it's a foundation of the site. It's still, you know, an amazing piece of engineering, because think about it, on the other side is the Hudson River and the waters of the Atlantic pressing on it. It's a dam which did not break. It held, and I succeeded in keeping it open for the public to see it. It's very difficult architecture to keep a foundation visible, because foundations are built in order to put something on top of them and hide them. But I was very moved when Pope Francis, when he came to New York, selected this slurry wall to give his speech of solidarity of humanity in face of terror and violence. And he spoke through that wall to the world. And that's really part of the message of the architecture. Here is the waterfalls, which are also part of my master plan, to bring nature and also to use it as a musical instrument to screen the busy streets of New York, which are very noisy. And I think when one comes to Ground Zero, it's a different experience of public space. Of course, out of the 16 acres of which are there, 8 acres are public space. And I fought for that because you know that in a capitalist society, every square centimeter is very expensive. It's hard to convince people not to build, to leave it open to the public, all the way from the street level down to the foundations of the site, to make it public and accessible. And that's indeed what this project is about. Project in a city that my mother came from, Warsaw, very close to where she lived. It's the old, really Jewish neighborhood of Warsaw, which became the place where Stalin built his symbol of oppression, the so-called Palace of Science and Culture. And I, again, won a competition here to create a residential tower that has a sort of sweeping wing of the Polish eagle that was really destroyed during that era, and brings that sense of dynamism to everyday life. It's a very simple tower in a way, because it has to be. It's a residential tower, but it asserts the importance of living in the center of the city, not just offices and hotels, but people's expectation. And here it is with the palace. There's an irony here. I couldn't make the tower any taller because of regulations, but it's a dialogue with history that is a very unexpected one in this central space of Warsaw, a city that is also so marked by war and destruction. The Jewish Museum, by the way, that was my first building. I actually never built. I never even designed a building beforehand. Even though I studied architecture, I thought that designing a building, imaginary building, is not possible because you don't have the client, you don't have the social space, you don't have the ethical correspondence. So I actually graduated from a great school of architecture, and they allowed me to graduate without designing a building. I had very good teachers like Richard Meyer and Peter Eisenman, John Haydock, some of the illustrious people. Anyway, I created a building that spoke about really the emptiness, the void of Berlin across that star that still shines with a kind of light of the unknown in terms of the future. And that black line, by the way, is the line where the wall stood. And I remember when I drew the star, and this was before, of course, the falling of the wall, I really felt that by drawing that star, that wall had no meaning. It had no meaning because Jews were not divided by East and West. They lived in the city as citizens, and not only in the city, but in the country. So the building is hard to explain verbally, but it's a spatial experience. It's an experience of light. It's an experience of the mind, of conscience, of nature, the many symbolic aspects of it. And I think every one of my buildings does have a symbolic aspect, including the aspect of total emptiness that is hardly possible to illuminate with light. So there it is, a building that I think had brought back a certain sense of hope and understanding to a city from which the destruction, not only of 6 million Jews, but of 50 million other people as a result of that war. So yes, that's, and here in Dresden, that sharp directedness is not an arbitrary angle. It's precisely plotted exactly in terms of a self-similar form. And I studied the maps of the Royal Air Force, which destroyed the city. The first, the triangulation of the bombing, which in 1945 really destroyed this beautiful city. And so it's a dialogue between the violence of war, but also the importance in a democracy of the military. It's not a pacifist museum, it's a museum about the importance of the military, importance of putting people in front of the building, in the winds, so to speak, of Dresden, in the winds of history, as being responsible for the future of their lives and their country. So it is an experience, it's a journey until one really understands, sees the catastrophes that happen in history, and one can also ascend and see that strange view, which is not, the Berchtesgaden, view, that big window or something onto Dresden, but a Dresden seen through a veil of history and the wind of history. It's a very dramatic experience to be there. I was there today actually, and yeah, it's always a new experience to stand and see Dresden from the position of the Dresden Blick, also the other cities that were destroyed. Wieliczka city in Poland, Coventry, all those cities, Rotterdam bombed from Dresden. So the catastrophe is history, but also the importance of reasserting the power of democracy. Here in the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, I did a very different idea, also a museum, but of the Allied kind. I thought that the world that we see on Google is really not the real world. It's just an imaginary world. The world is fragmented, it's fractured. The world is in pieces. As we look at the violence and the genocides also that are encompassing us, we have to see that the world is not that image of the perfect sphere in a blue cloud. And so this building is made out of these shards. Each space is part of that, the water shard, the air shard, the earth shard, the shard of fire in the exhibitions. It stands on the ship canal, and it has really renovated the life of this area that was really a troubled area in the history of Manchester, and is a very dramatic museum which tells its story not with much collections, but really through sound and light, through a simple technique in which even a school class can assemble photographs and children at war, women at war, what is happening today. So and of course there's some emblematic objects like the cannon that shot the first projectiles in World War I, and the Sherman tank, and also there are other ways you can experience history in these silos that hold materials that may be interesting. And that's the last thing I would like to. I just built a museum in Lithuania, in Vilnius, a very beautiful city, Museum of Modern Art, and it's a very modest museum. A private collector has collected thousands of works of Lithuanian artists from the communist era who may have had jobs through the government, but at home painted paintings that were their own expression of what life was about in a kind of illegal way. And he collected thousands, more than 6,000 of these amazing works of art that show that art never dies, that even in times of darkness, people cannot be subjected all the way. They can be profoundly affected, but people remain spiritual beings that believe and have the force of. And of course, the museum is small, but it has an outdoor space. It's on several levels. There's a cafe. It has become really an area, sort of a piece of that neighborhood that really has recreated it in its own special way. So, again, what I was going to just say, that dreams of freedom are not empty. They are with us. And as I worked on this exhibition and started with my love for these paintings, because really each one of these artists the encounter with the actual work, not with a reproduction in a book, is just stunning. And I recommend, if you haven't seen it, just to go and look at those incredible paintings and documents that we have here in Dresden. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Did you bring us some images of the show in Moscow and the first sketches?
No, I did not. I wish I had. But, I can say that the Moscow exhibition and the one in Dresden are different. They're sort of brothers. I call it brothers. But I also, in James Joyce said that brother is like an umbrella. It's very easy to lose the brother. So the shows are different because the space is different. The place is different, but they're connected by the sense of the drama of a kind of connective labyrinth of spiraling spaces that intersect and then are cut by cardinal directions that connect Russia and Germany across Poland in the middle between Moscow and Dresden, and give a certain glimpse into a kind of unknown that still is beyond the paintings and beyond your experience. And I think if you stand in those slots and look across the colors, the red, the grays that change into blacks, you can see that history is an enigma. We don't know the consequence of history. Some think that history is a nightmare that we should wake up from. Others think that history is going to result in some form of apocalypse, either good or bad. But anyway, we're in between, and I've always believed this, that we are threatened really by two things. Civilization, as Valerie said, is threatened by two dangers: order and disorder. The big threats to the civilization are the threat of order, the marching on of history, and the threat of disorder, which is chaos and breakdown of society. And somehow the space in between is also the space in this exhibition. It's the in-between space. You're in between tensions of art, tensions of thematic organization, tensions of light, tensions of color. Yeah, so that's in a way kind of a short description. Of course, the show in Moscow is very different because Moscow is big and Russia is big and the space was big, almost twice as large, with more works. But again, the correspondence, I think, is there, and I think yeah, it's something to experience, not just intellectually, but also emotionally, because the paintings are full of emotion.
So this is a point where we can include Holger Birkholz, our conservator. So how was it for you to work together with Daniel? And you worked really close together with Sergei and the studio.
Something which is always very interesting in working as a curator and in working with such a wonderful collection of artworks which we have now here in the Albertinum, which consists of 600 paintings from this Romantic period, is to think about these artworks in different contexts. We have usually this idea of a permanent collection, permanent exhibition, but we came away from it in some way and decided, when I started in 2016 here, that we want to change more the works in the so-called permanent collection to try how the artworks are speaking in other neighborhoods. So we changed a lot during the last years, and in the case of the exhibition Dreams of Freedom, it was a big chance, I think, to try again another kind of narration, to have the artworks from Dresden next to artworks from Russia, which is very interesting to see where they are related in some way, and in other ways where they differ. And the architecture of Daniel Libeskind, which I'm very happy that that the artworks are in now, makes them appear, in a way that makes the historical issues more clear. You just mentioned the difference between narrow spaces, wide spaces in the exhibition, and I think something is very important for us here in the narration of the exhibition, that it is not linear in its structure. Even though there are two linear structures in the exhibition. So we have these folded lines on one hand, but the dynamic in the exhibition creates by folding them in each other and having these intersections in the walls. So there are in the exhibition and in the structure of the architecture, there are different structures collapsing and they work together and criticize each other. So it's a very complex structure that allows, I think, different views, which is very good for the artworks, because in art history and art history science there are a lot of discussions about what is the meaning of the painting. And sometimes my colleagues in art history, they try to find they speak about artworks as if they were riddles that need to be solved. They want to have this directly symbolic interpretations. That's for example, in talking about Caspar David Friedrich, there's always a big discussion: and is Caspar David Friedrich political or is he religious? And I think it's nothing we have to discuss beside each other, but it's together in the artworks, and it's much more in it. And I think the big chance of this architectural structure by Daniel Libeskind is to show this complexity and to open the complexity in the artworks as well. And so I'm very happy about this. Yeah, so there are things which work together, and on the other hand, there are contrasts, and it's the same in this in the way how the artworks and the architecture in somewhere interfere. This is quite different also from Moscow. In Dresden, we choose at some walls of the installation, we used a very classical way how to show paintings from the Romantic period. This is to have a big painting in the middle and to have a small one on each side. And this is something we tried not to do in Moscow because the space in Moscow was so wide, and you had views from far on the walls and on the paintings. But in this narrow situation where there is no wall, you can see from this 90 degrees angle, you always come to the walls from a very sharp angle. Yeah, it became very interesting to use this historical romantic kind of presentation. We have it very strongly in the Caspar David Friedrich space of the exhibition. We used it. Yeah, this is something I found very interesting. It was very interesting for me that you used the word irony when you have been talking about your architecture. Irony is such an important topic for Romantic theory, so it's kind of interfere between this with big ideals you cannot reach and the reality which is imperfect. And I think also in this situation, the architecture fits quite good to romantic irony, and the solution in this conflict of the perfectness and imperfectness is a kind of humor. And this is something I wanted to ask you: if thinking about your work, is humor an interesting reference for you in a very philosophical way?
No. No, I only think bad buildings are funny. But
I don't know. I do not mean it in this sense of funny. So humor has a lot of different. Humor can also be very tragical, keeping in mind that you cannot reach what you want to.
Well, none of the buildings I've done, unless they are, commercial developments of, shopping or something, large-scale centers that I've done also, have that because I think history doesn't have, to me, humor. It's something that is ongoing because it's not over. It's not in the past. Most people think that history is something that is in the past. But as Faulkner, I think, said in his Nobel Prize speech, history is not over, just wait. So in that sense, fatalism is pretty easy, to be fatalistic about history, but I'm not, because you have to believe in something better, and you have to have a belief in something in order to construct any building, because buildings have a longevity. First of all, it takes a lot of effort to build even a small building. It takes a lot of resources to build a building. It's very difficult, as you know, in the Baroque time, some architects tried to do funny buildings or commentaries on architecture, and postmodernism certainly tried to make a kind of ironic statement about the world. But I don't think they were successful because they were subsumed in the history which they themselves were part of. So, to answer your question, I don't think, humor is part of architecture, but in the sense that the four humors, the choleric and the sanguine and the melancholic, the humors as a sense of of, you know, the character. Sure, born under Saturn. Yes, so yes.
I would like to come back to the architecture for the show in Moscow and in Dresden, because the labyrinth was really an important part of your concept, and also the dualisms. Open, closed, you have vistas, perspectives, but you have dead ends too. You get lost, but you can find new ways. Maybe you can go into this.
Well, here in Dresden, for example, when you walk through the exhibition, you have both an inner and outer view of the space. You can be outside, feel that the paintings, you're looking at the paintings from an external point of view, from a kind of, as if you were in a landscape. But then you can also enter the spaces and you can feel like you're in an interior with paintings hanging in, or vistas from a room. So it has a sort of a duality of where you know, depending how you view it yourself. And I, by the way, thought it was very important that people have their own topography that they draw, that they are not drawn to a topography that is pre-made, but they make their own traces that gives them a sense of being able to navigate the space on their own. And of course, there will be many different routes and I think many different possibilities. But I think in Moscow, of course, it was a little different because there was greater distances, greater perspectives. So look, let's be honest. The space here is it's a shoebox space, basically in a little shoebox. And the question is, how do you display these paintings? Well, what do you do inside? Do you put some walls in? Do you put the linear? Do you make people walk through and from painting to painting? How do you extend the amount of time possible to give you a sense that, yeah, that those paintings are part of your experience as well? And I think it is about extending the time. And to me, architecture is about space and time, of course. But what is time? Time is a movement. It has a beginning when you start moving, and it has an end when you stop moving. and so I think there is that kind of musical experience. And of course they are different because the spirals in Moscow were very large and you could see them intersecting, you can experience them. Here the spirals are more like shackles that have been broken apart. I mean, that's a dream of freedom as well. The breakdown of a restraint and a kind of something beyond the restraint of the space that is in your imagination and also in your perspective. So yeah, it's a kind of a bit.
In our little conversation that we did for the catalogue, you spoke about Daedalus as the first architect and the concept of the labyrinth that also has a lot to do with freedom, of course.
Definitely. Well, you all know the story of the labyrinth, right? Daedalus constructed the labyrinth, the greatest building. But he also constructed, you know, the wings to get out of the labyrinth. You know, the airplane, that Letalin, getting out of the labyrinth, which is of course very dangerous because if you fly too close to light, your wings melt and you die. So I think the labyrinth has a great, you know, every city in a way is a labyrinth. It's true, we take it for granted because we know the cities, but we don't know the inner workings of the cities. We don't know simultaneously all the people who are in the city. What are they doing? Exactly at the moment where you're walking on the street. What is happening to all the minds, to all the loves, to all the desires? It's an invisible topography of a labyrinth, which is difficult to fathom because the walls and streets of a city provide a simple vista of the external. In the Noli plan of Rome, if you look at the Noli plan of Rome, it's beautifully one of the best drawn city plans because you see the streets, the buildings are dark, but then he continues the space inside of the buildings. He doesn't go into the rooms themselves. He goes into the staircases and the main sort of entries. But if you look at the Noli plan of Rome, you can see how complex the city really is. I don't think we even know how complex the city is. Maybe in destruction we understand it. When cities are destroyed, whether it's Ground Zero or Dresden or Berlin, we understand what the city really was like before. But yeah, just a thought.
Selfira, what was your first impression when you came to see the show here?
It was not something unexpected because, as Holger mentioned, we were working very closely together. We were working with our German colleagues while we were developing the concept and then worked on the architecture for the Moscow venue, and it was amazing for all of us, I think, how much people can accomplish being stuck in their apartments, stuck to their computers, because we did it exactly at the time when the pandemic started, and we all were imprisoned in our houses in spring of 2020, not understanding what will be happening. For me, it was very important to see your reaction when you came to Moscow, also missing your plane on the previous day and coming just at the moment when we started our speeches. And speeches in Moscow lasted twice as long as the ones yesterday, because we couldn't provide for a simultaneous translation. And also there were more politicians, I think, than last night here. And I would like to say a few words still about Moscow venue, because what was amazing with that architecture was not only the general concept, the structure, and there were these two intersecting lines through which you can go. Here, these lines turned into narrow but very tall holes, in fact, in the walls, through which you cannot go because they're too narrow. And this creates two different feelings when you compare Moscow to Dresden. And when we started coming to look at the architecture, because the architecture was built, but the museum was closed, and we were to postpone the show. So, like with the Jewish Museum in Berlin, we were touring the empty space. I couldn't imagine why, for example, at the very end of these two intersecting lines, you insisting on leaving space empty, because what usually curators do, if there is a distance, you put at the distance the most important painting to attract the visitors to go in that direction. And here there was nothing, huge empty wall. There are empty walls here, by the way, and empty walls constitute a very important part of the concept of the architecture of this exhibition. But when we started hanging the pieces, I understood that nothing at the end of this vista, which looked as a series of repeating frames, and also we question, why do you put these red lines on the floor? Because they will become dirty, weather is not the best one in Moscow. Nothing happened, by the way, with them. They worked, and only then we again understood why you did this, because with the empty vista, it was the concept of endlessness, which was one of the major concepts of Romanticism. That's what is being expressed in the work by Ivana Ivazovsky, The Black Sea, and the works by Sugimoto and Wolfgang Tillmans. Coming here, I understood that in some ways it's better to have less works to express this or that idea, because our German colleagues were to diminish the amount of artworks because of the limitations of the space, though I still don't understand how this architecture managed to include so many artworks. And some of the conclusions are much more obvious here with lesser works, but still I must admit I miss something which was in Moscow, like the cabinet, where there were so many things, subtle but very important things, like letters from Zhukovsky to Caspar David Friedrich, when Caspar David Friedrich, letters from Caspar David Friedrich to Zhukovsky, written at the moment when the artist was already very sick and couldn't work anymore, and Zhukovsky provided for a special pension for him from the Russian Tsar Nicholas I, who was the first to buy the works by Caspar David Friedrich. And if you will go to the show, you will see 3 magnificent works by Caspar David Friedrich acquired by the Tsar through Zhukovsky also, which are now in the collection of the State Hermitage. The best, apart from Germany, collection of the works of this artist in the world. So I miss the story about Decembrists and the revolt of Russian aristocracy, who in 1813 came to Paris. And we know that with the invasion of Napoleon's troops, they were followed by the Codex of Napoleon. So it's ambiguity, ambivalence of many things which are so well expressed through the architecture here, but I do understand that this story means so much for Russia. But maybe there are stories which are expressed also or told using different documents here, which are closer to the audience in Dresden, and that's great. I always think about every exhibition, every great exhibition, strong exhibition, as a piece of art. And it's great that interpretation of these concepts could be different, could differ. And I like both. People were asking me, which exhibition do you like more? I like both, and it's incredible that it appeared possible to do such fantastic presentations 2 times, not just copying or scaling what was already found for Moscow. And that confirms that this concept, the concept of this exhibition and the architectural concept was something incredibly full, rich, having so many meanings and facets. And we live now in the world which needs a discussion with hues and tunes and with subtle things, and I hate the concept of black and white. So here it's exactly the opposite.
So before we open to the public, and you can already think about questions you might have, I want to ask Holger, first of all, if he has something to add. And then I would like to close our round with the question about freedom. So freedom as a concept in Romanticism, in the show, but also maybe in our personal lives. Like please, Holger, if you.
Yeah, I think most of the things have already been mentioned, and somehow it's a little bit like with artists who are asked to explain their artworks just with the curators. I think we did the job, and you have to decide and find your way to the exhibition. So maybe it's not too good to tell too many stories about the concepts of an exhibition, because I think the concept has to work in the space. But I think this is the question on freedom is the central question on the exhibition. We have chapters in the exhibition like freedom of art, and maybe there will also be the question: what's the freedom of the architect, who is an artist? And we have a chapter of on the impossibility of freedom. So the problem to gain freedom in the society in each stage of history. So I think this is always a question, and I think it's important to keep in mind that this is something we tried with the documents in the vitrines to show that freedom is not like freedom. So there are so different ideas of freedom in the society, and I think everybody of us has a slightly different idea of freedom. For example, we have the Verfassung of Saxony from 1831, where there is the idea of economic freedom, and we have this diary from Theodor Körner from the Battle of Nations, and there are very aggressive poems in it, and his idea of freedom is the idea which comes in opposite to another country. So it's on nationalism in a very problematic way. And yeah, I think it's important to understand that there are conflicts between these ideas of freedom. This is why I always love, every time in the morning, I cross a place here in Dresden. It's the Rosa Luxemburg Square, and there is this wonderful sentence that freedom is always the freedom of the person who is of another opinion, has another idea of freedom. So you have to respect the other idea of freedom and the other kind of freedom. Excuse me, I do not have the exact translation of this, but I hope you understand what I mean. And so this is something we tried to give it space in the exhibition. So the freedom in this exhibition also means that you have to decide where to go, and this also means you have to. It's a responsibility in this decision, which way you go and which kind of freedom you choose, and how to accept the freedom of other people.
Daniel, freedom was always important in your work, thinking about the Freedom Towers, for example.
Well, sure, we want to be free, but what does it mean? That's a really great question that philosophers struggled with. In many ways, I think freedom is, we've constructed a gigantic, castle of freedom, but we live in the sort of workman's shack next to it. So there's this huge castle, but we are in the workman's, little hovel. It's hard to, someone said, we are, what is freedom? We have freedom, we have no choice. Yeah. I think that says everything. We have freedom, we have no choice. And I think that's the struggle that I think everyone, whether it's in the family, in their own lives, in their political, social lives, in their bigger vision of the world, I don't think there is, it's a paradox. It's a paradox. And I always think about it when I read Kafka's Metamorphosis. What is the German title of Metamorphosis? Verwandlung. Verwandlung, yeah. When he wakes up one morning and he's turned into this bug, and his mother is calling him. It's already time. It's already 6:30. You have to go. The train is leaving at 7, and he doesn't know what to do because the legs are up in the high and he can't turn back. So it's a great question, which we all struggle with. I think every person, and if we don't struggle with it now, we'll struggle with it in the future for sure. At a moment when we least expect it, I'm sure that'll come. There'll be that moment where a question that seems very esoteric, very academic, very abstract, a kind of philosophical question, will have a really, truly personal sort of decision of some sort. So yeah, it's a great question to consider. We are really sort of standing on the shoulders of giants. But do we see really more? Just because we are standing on those shoulders? That's a question. Do we really see more with our technology? Do we see really more with our, our notion of who we are today? And then the question is, what will freedom be like tomorrow? We see the threats. I live in the United States, but we see the threats to democracies everywhere in the world. And I really think about it a lot. What will happen? It does depend on us, but it's not obvious what will happen. It will depend on our decisions. But anyway, democracies and open society are vulnerable, and we know that. And we've seen how democracies can be used by people to overturn democracy from within democracy. From within democratic systems, you can also invert democracy. And anyway, what is a democratic system? How fair is it in the first place? Do we have a true democracy when we elect people once every 4 years? Yeah, okay, just a few thoughts on the impossibility of freedom.
Ja, gibt es aus dem Publikum schon Fragen oder von den Kollegen Sergej, Marion Ackermann oder Julia?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It was super interesting and very moving to listen to all four of you. I can imagine, Daniel, that you're approached very often. There's this project and that project. How do you decide which ones you do and which ones you decline?
Actually, I never decide. It's Nina who decides. I always say, everyone wants to be free. I just want to be dependent.
Frau Ackermann.
So I have two questions. The one is, I think it's a very physical experience to go through your architecture. And we have this German word or concept of Entgrenzung in the Romantic period. You can't really translate it literally. So it's endlessness, borderlessness, but it's not the same. Because it means the dissolving the body into something, nature and so. And in the reception of the Romantic, so with Kandinsky and then later in the 60s, they always stress this physical experience. And when I go through your architecture, I always have the feeling it is like with Bruce Nauman or with Joseph Beuys, who created in the 60s this exhibition where you have something like a blocking of your path. And so this was my first question, how much you're also perhaps influenced or in dialogue with these concepts of these artists. And the other question is, I haven't been aware of that you started so late to build buildings. So in our world of museums, we discuss since years the concept of museum without walls, which means to be more in the society, democracy, outreach programs. Could you imagine to build one day a museum without walls?
That's a great question. Museum without walls. Well, I think you already implied in your question something very profound, that we often forget that we are not just conscious with our brains, or our language, that we carry with us, or we are part of the flesh. Call it the body, but it's more like the flesh because it's not distant from us. It's just part of us. If you remember reading the Discourse on Method, Descartes, which is the book, the thought that gave us modern science. At one point, Descartes, who's sitting somewhere, I don't remember where, is saying, I'm thinking, and I'm doubting and so on. And then one point he says, right now, I don't even have a body. He says it. Right now, I don't even have a body. I'm cogito. I'm the pure thought itself. And I'm always imagining Descartes sitting next to, the fireplace in his bathrobe, because he describes that he's in a bathrobe. He's, he's a scholar, he's a thinker, he's meditating. But, forgetting the body in architecture is, I think, a very bad thing. Because much of our architecture is enforcing a certain conformity of the flesh. And we all walk the same, we all do the same, we all repeat certain conventional movements. But it's not necessarily so. In freedom, you can dance, you can choreograph a different sense of participation. So I'm often worried about turning architecture into a scientific or a scientistic, pseudo-scientific discipline, where a sort of cause A causes B causes C. And I think most of our buildings are built that way. They are really exercises of domination. They dominate us. We hardly know. Look, why do we live in a little room? Why are we born in a room with 4 angles that are right? Why do we die in a room with 4 angles that are... I mean, are we destined? Were we always destined to be there in that capsule? Why did we agree to live in that world? Is there any rebellion against it? Well, there is in art and in philosophy, but architecture is very slow to change. Think about it. We live pretty much like people lived 50,000 years ago. Not that different. You go to Knossos, go to the early. We live pretty much the bed next to the wall, a hole in the wall, a door, and it's perplexing when we have modern science. We have amazing medical knowledge. We have the DNA, the genome. We have, space opening up. Why are we resistant? Why are we, as Piranesi said, in prison? His series, The Prisons, where he gives freedom to those little figures in this vast, dark world of complex architecture, the city. So anyway, that's my question. It might happen that with new technology and with a new sense of the spiritual, we might change our attitude overnight. Cities might not be looking the way they are today. We might have a different world. It's not a mystical thought. Society doesn't change slowly. Changes on a moment's notice. So that's just my thought about the kind of complex questions you gave me. Very difficult to answer.
Da vorne ist noch eine Frage.
So, continuing a little on that tone that you're having here. I think we are celebrating wonders of the past, painting, and how architecture shapes it all. But are we missing something? What's happening at the moment? Are these fantastic institutions really living in the past and everyone is moving, not everyone, but everyone who's going to change and are changing this world don't care? And I think it's a very important point. My feeling is that we are really missing something, and that we are not really preparing ourselves to what is coming. How do you see that, Daniel Libeskind? Architecture, you are building for the future. How do you see this issue of us getting lost, in a way, in the past?
Getting lost in the past? Well, we can't help it. We are not in control of time. We are not in control of time. We are finite. We are not gods. We know we're going to die. And that's the interesting thing, that every philosophy, every society in time starts with the same question. What is the idea of living if you're going to die? What are we going to do with this thought that we are alive? Once we are, out of the innocence of childhood, we know we're going to die. So what is life about? So all religions start with that thought. They have different answers. Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Muslims have different sense of answering that question. But it's a good question to ask. I don't have an answer. Nobody does. Let's say it's still a question to be grappled with. No matter what we are told by, the people are going to fly, the rich people to Mars, to live in Mars. I mean, think about it. Almost all the billionaires want to go to Mars. Why is it that the billionaires want to go to Mars? And they can afford it, right? They can afford. I was recently, luckily, had a dinner with one of the astronauts who spent the longest time on the space shuttle. And I asked him, because he was the longest amount of time on the space shuttle, and I said to him, so when you were out there fixing, in the middle of the void, the darkness, and looking down and seeing, the Earth, what were you thinking? And he said, it was very simple. I was looking down and I thought, we already live in paradise. We don't understand, we are in paradise. People think they still need to get to paradise, but when you are in this void, you understand, we are so lucky we live in paradise, if we can get back down from this. So yeah, and in a way, that's a great, sort of a great experience of someone who has looked from that technical void and that achievement of the human spirit to fly out of the world. And yeah, but I always thought that, we are, if we are not a billionaire and going to escape from the Earth, then we should have a probe, some sort of a NASA program to rediscover what we've already are in the process of destroying completely, with the destruction of the Earth, of oceans, of the living beings, of humanity itself. Shouldn't we have a probe to try to understand what we have done? What are our responsibilities? Yeah, that's a good point. And I agree with you that maybe there will be a generation, the new generation, that is not guilty of destroying the planet as the older generation was, that will reorient itself and away from spaceflight and into the Earth. Maybe. Who knows?
Sergei Fofanov, der Co-Kurator aus Moskau.
Dear Daniel, thank you very much for incredible ideas that you shared with us, also in Moscow and here, and I'm just stunned by your ways of thinking. I'm too tired to make philosophical questions, but I just only one question, which is very general. What you discovered for yourself personally during this preparing of this exhibition in Moscow and in Dresden, and maybe also about the time, the feelings and the thoughts, art around 1800. Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I discovered how much I love Moscow and Dresden. Really, I mean, how lucky can a person be to go to those two cities and to be able to walk and see amazing art? I mean, that's kind of nirvana, I would say, to be in those cities and to work with the great intellects, great experts who tell you something, sometimes in a sentence, that you think for the next 3 weeks what that sentence really meant. I discovered many things. I discovered, first of all, this incredible correlation of artists, that both German and Russian artists who struggled to make sense of violence, of political chaos, of their own loneliness, of the future. It's I have to say, I felt like I would love to spend hours and hours looking at each painting. That was my sense. Like, I'd like to spend hours standing in front of this painting and just look at it and think about it. But I've gathered in my mind these works. And I think my thought is very simple. That is the time the kind of axial time that changed the world. These artists and what was in their being and in their memories changed the world. We are part of that world somehow. And how did it happen? It happened in their use of pigment, in the way they used their brushes and the way those writers, I mean, what blew my mind in Moscow actually is when I saw the copy of Karl Marx in the exhibition of Das Kapital. And I never thought of Marx in that context, and suddenly says, oh my God, he's part of this movement of romantic dreams, of failed utopias and so on. So anyway, I learned a lot. I can't enumerate it, but definitely changed my idea of what I should do also in my studies and in my future work. It has had a very big impact on me. Working with all of you, learning from you, and also having the chance to encounter a kind of constructive process. Yeah, so thank you.
Yes, I think this was really a very nice last sentence. And I think if there's no question, there is one. Oh, there are two also. Sorry, I didn't see you.
So first of all, I would like to say thank you for this great exhibition, which I had the possibility to see in Moscow as well, especially in those times where the relations between Germany and Russia and quite desolate situation. So, and this is the background for my question to you, Zelfira Ismailovna and Mr. Libeskind, because I've been part of the team as well of Moscow Berlin, the exhibition you have already mentioned. I'm working now in the Militärhistorischen Museum here in Dresden, and I was just wondering which was your feeling those times in 1995 when the Russian-German relationships has been so completely different, so very positive and progressive 25 years ago, and the German-Russian relations today, which are in a quite sad situation at the moment. So why did you decide, or what did you feel when you did this exhibition 25 years ago about the German-Russian relations and the exhibition today? And what do you think can cultural project, and especially art, how can they support or even change political situations and the relations between countries? Thank you.
Well, that's not a question I can answer. You know, I'm not a politician. I'm not, you know, but all I know is that the contact with people, if you're lucky to meet people across borders, across divisions, across all those barriers, then we realize we are all pretty much sharing the world. Pretty much the same, because we have families, we have love, we have desires, we have problems, we have disappointments, we have aspirations. I think that's what makes us really human. We have dreams. And in that sense, you know, maybe you'll think this is very callous, but I'm a little more oblivious to politics. You know, I used to think that everything is driven by politics. And maybe it's true, but as I have navigated through different countries, through different societies, I realized that people are much more open-minded, and that the change will come not in an obvious ways today, maybe, not through sort of revolutions, people marching on the streets, but in totally different ways, just in a different way. So I'm just fortunate to work with people, and I do believe that in the end, people have the same interests. They have interest in peace, they have interest in life, they have interest in sharing the world. And I don't think we should be too impressed by people who have different agendas, because a lot of it is just hot air.
Zelfira, do you want to answer too?
Yeah, trying to be quick. Yes, I remember very well 1990s. That was a moment when, after perestroika, all those who had great education, bright minds, got the possibility of doing incredible things. incredible legendary exhibitions like the Great Utopia, which was done in Frankfurt, in New York, in Amsterdam, in Moscow, Berlin, Moscow, and many other shows, and cultural contacts between Germany and Russia were incredibly intense. We organized huge exhibitions almost every year, and Moscow, Berlin was a unique show. And I already for several years am thinking about that show, which you had put in such a fantastic and perfect shape and architecture with all those 20 curators, as of a show which we couldn't make today. We wouldn't manage, we would be blamed for all possible invented sins if we would do it today. And then somehow it happened that in the first decade, and especially in the second decade of this century, these contacts started to diminish, at least in the field of museum exchange. And I think that was the idea which stood behind Marin's and my intention to do something which would bring back those glorious days when we were opening for each other the art and culture of each country, and when we were looking at some points where there was such an incredible mutual understanding, influence, reaction, dialogue. So we found this subject, we found this theme. I think the answer to your question, Christiane, to the last part of it, we got it yesterday.
Ich bin in diese Richtung etwas geblendet, aber ich glaube, es ist Professor Fettweis, richtig? Ja.
Absolutely right. Gerhard, my name. So I have a question. Obviously, if we define freedom, freedom is the space we can take only by respecting others, right? So, I mean, as soon as we take too much of our freedom, it's a disrespect of others, and then it becomes dictatorship. So in your discussion about dominance of buildings and democracy, how do you see current architecture? Because right now, if you look at what is called a Freedom Tower, it's not very democratic, right? It sort of dominates that whole area. Whereas if we think of architecture that is sort of interweaved into a city and is more democratic, how would that sort of interplay? Obviously, I mean, as people that love art, we also love to see something dominate once in a while. So I'm not criticizing that at all. But the question is, how do you see architecture developing now, currently, in its current stage, as it is sort of this interplay between dominance and democratic architecture and respect of freedom?
Good question. I mean, democracy does not suggest neutrality. Democracy does not suggest a vague sort of senselessness. Democracy has a hierarchy, has a structure. It's not just a malleable nothing. And of course, democracy has to respond to many stakeholders in our Western democracies. It does it differently in China, does it different in other places, but certainly in New York, it's a combination of complex stakeholders that controls not just the money, but the power of what can be done. Planning agencies. Look at Berlin. Why has Berlin changed so little, given the expectations of Berlin becoming more people-oriented? Because of the dominance of a certain planning ideology in Berlin, to keep the city low, to expand the development into the suburbs, to continue to consume nature and land. So, you know, it's a very complicated question to answer, but all I'm saying is that you have to find a shape. And in architecture, the shape is not just the shape of geometry or shape of buildings, the shape that is given by the society, by the democratic society. And of course, you have to balance the powers. All I can tell you that at ground zero, my victory and the victory of those who supported me was to create a public space, which is very difficult to create the largest public space in a city that is consumed by a capitalist culture of dominating companies. So that's not a small achievement, by the way, to give space to a community and as a result to build a community. It's not what the ground zero is, it's the development of Lower Manhattan itself, which has blossomed into the new center of New York. It's not the Midtown, it's not Uptown, East Side, West Side, it's not the Village, it's Lower Manhattan that is the engine now of people living, schools, apartment buildings. And by the way, I'm also now working on what they call affordable housing. In the old times would be called social housing. I won several competitions, including 2 in New York, to create housing at the lowest, really costs. It's public housing. They have very little money for it. But my thought was to show that architects should tackle this project to create decent housing that is sustainable, that people like to live in, even though it's very, very low cost. And that's under construction in Brooklyn and another project in Long Island. So yes, that's social responsibility is there. And I think the more people participate in the city, the more they demand with their voice, and the more they really push the politicians and the powers that be, the better the city will be. And that's true for every city in the world. That's why I also believe in mayors of cities, because mayors have such power. Outside of the ideology, they have to take care of the city. So very often a good mayor can do more than a president of a country.
Ja, ich habe versprochen, dass wir pünktlich Schluss machen, weil die Liebeskinds noch heute weiter müssen. So thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you so much, Nina. Thank you so much, Stefan Blach. Where is he? And David Heaton, for being here and for this wonderful project. Selfira, Marion Ackermann. We are hoping for the next Russian-German cooperation soon, because we have to go on, and soon. And Holger and Sergei, and of course Ludmila, thank you so much for this wonderful exhibition. And thank you so much for coming. Bye.